I'm Chris Lee of Southeastern14.com, joined by Blake Lovell. We've got 4 SEC basketball games to discuss. From Tuesday night, let's start with the biggest one, Auburn and Alabama, in one of the more fun games I have watched in January, Blake. Jabari Smith was just a stud in that one as Auburn hangs on at the end for an 81-77 win.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to laugh like we were laughing before we started recording about you don't get many nights where games sort of play out the way you expect in the SEC, and this was kind of one of those nights I thought with most of pretty much every game. I think sort of played out the way we expected. I mean, I said going into this game that as much as you would probably look at Alabama and say this is a really good spot for them to bounce back and be in a position to win after that just shocking loss at Missouri. Just didn't like the matchup because as we've said, Auburn's the best team in the league, and Auburn
if not
is
the
quite
country
frankly,
at this point.
well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you know me, I don't really pay attention to polls at all, and to be honest with you, I think I texted you last night and may have texted someone else about, yeah, I mean, like I think Auburn's easily a top 5 team, and then I looked up and I just realized that they were ranked number 4. Like I don't really pay attention to polls all that much, and so like it's just one of those where Auburn's a better team right now, and Alabama's going to get there, I think, eventually. I'm not saying they're going to get to where Auburn is at, but Alabama, I'm still not, just jumping off the Alabama bandwagon just yet, even though they are sitting here now at 11-5 and 2-2 in the league, and they are coming off that loss to Missouri, and now they almost rallied for that win against Auburn. I think Alabama will get there, but it's the same stuff we've talked about all season long with them. They're just really inconsistent. They don't shoot the three as well as they did last year, and they're not as good of a defensive team for 40 minutes as they were last year. It's all those things, and so I think that's a team like Auburn's going to take advantage of that, and that's exactly what they did. And it's one of those where Alabama hits a couple more threes, where they go 7 of 30 or 31, they shoot 23% from three. I think you hit a couple more threes, a different game, but anyone's going to have a hard time beating Auburn. I'm not saying they're going to run through the league similar to the way maybe Alabama did last season, but they've got the tools to do so, and we'll see if that happens. But yeah, I mean, I think the takeaway here is Jabari Smith is one of the best players in the country, and it's crazy to think. We'll talk about Kentucky in a second, but you talk about an SEC Player of the Year vote right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it Jabari Smith or is it Oscar Tshiebwe? And like, it is one of those things where it's like, man, those two guys are clearly above, I think, the rest of the pack right now. And clearly, I mean, Jabari Smith was the reason they won that game. And remember too, they won this game without Walker Kessler being a factor whatsoever. Yep. But that is something we talked about, right? We said, if you're Alabama, one of the paths to winning this game was going to be getting Walker Kessler in foul trouble. And that's exactly what happened here. And yet Auburn still finds a way to win.
Yeah, Dylan Cardwell really stepped up for Kessler when he was out. But go back to Jabari Smith for a moment. You hear the Kevin Durant comps. I'm not a big fan of comparing 18-year-olds to
yes.
to future Hall of Famers, but look, you can see why they dropped those, right?
Yeah, I am. I hate comparisons. Like, I understand why we do it, but it's like, it's the whole thing, even going back to, Jordan and Kobe and LeBron, and it's just like, come on, like, they're just different. They're all different players. But yes, like you can certainly understand why, and that's why I think that certainly speaks highly of what you think of Jabari Smith. And and that's what we said coming this season. We said that he was expected to be as good as advertised. I think he's probably been even better than we thought he'd be to this point. We knew he's going to be good, but I don't know. I mean, he's just been on another level. And it's one of those things too, where with Auburn, they're sitting here. Let's remember, like they're sitting here in the SEC now at 4-0, and they've beaten, arguably 3 of the top 6 or 7 teams to this point. And it's just like, that's because of Jabari Smith. That's because of the guards that are playing as well as they're playing right now. They are the complete package. And like you said, they would not surprise anyone if they're sitting here as the number 1 team in the country sooner rather than later, and maybe as early as next week, depending on how things go on Saturday at Ole Miss. So,
Yeah, they've had probably the toughest schedule in the league so far. And they're 4-0, as you said. They've got Ole Miss on the road, Georgia at home coming up. Should win both those. Although Ole Miss has been a little tricky for teams lately. Although maybe not as much last night. But yeah, I look at this team and don't get mad at us, Auburn fans, because this is what happens when you're at the top. People start to pick you apart and look for weaknesses. And the only one that I can really find at this point, well, first of all, Alan Flanagan's health, that's got to hold up, or anything like that could, throw a wrench into things. You saw a collision late in the game where I think Jabari Smith and who was it, KD Johnson ran into each other, and then you're like, oh man, please let those guys be okay, which they were. Outside of something like that happening, the biggest thing that I can spot with them is a flaw, and I don't know how prevalent it's been in all their games because I haven't seen all of them, but the one thing that could have undone them last night, and I love this guy as a player, I love his talent, love his enthusiasm, he gives them a spark, but I thought for a while that Wendell Green might shoot them out of that game, Blake. He was taking some long jumpers that were really not necessary at the point he took them.
That's just, I think this was the scenario more than anything. I don't really recall a situation like that for him this season. I'm going to pull up his stat line here right now. I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
He was 7 of 20, but I mean, he missed some almost 30-foot threes that there was no business taking when he took them.
But I think sometimes that's just a player trying to, at his position, I think trying to make a play. And I'm looking back now. I had to pull up his game logs because I was thinking, like, I've watched him play, of course, a lot, and there's nothing this season that compares to that for him. So I think it's just one of those games kind of where you get into, rivalry game. You want to be the guy that's, can make those big plays, hit those big shots. And let's be honest too. I mean, we talk about comparisons, like Jared Harper had some of those games, right? Like at some point during his Auburn career where he put up some long shots and maybe he didn't think it was the best of shots, but eventually, he started making those. And we all know how we remember him now. I'm not saying we're going to say the exact same things about Green, but that is a comparison that people have made this season, as we know. And I think it's just, you're going to have some of those games. And I think it's, once again, it'd be different. I think if he's a power forward, but he's the point guard. And I think you're just going to have some of those games where you have a guy that just doesn't make shots like that. So to me, I don't view that as a long-term weakness of any kind or something that could, put them in a bad spot. I think that's just flow of the game. Sometimes you're going to have some of those scenarios like that play out, especially when it's a guy who handles the ball and has the ball in his hands as much as he does. So that's probably what I would kind of draw that up to, just, again, being the magnitude of the game and someone that's just kind of trying to make plays. So,
well, in his defense, he'd hit a couple of those. And, adrenaline's going, you're trying to make a play for your team. Again, this is what we do when we can't find anything that's obvious. Right. I mean, this team has guards. This team has bigs who can shoot it outside. This team has bigs who can block shots. This team has depth. This has got Final Four written all over it. And as I pointed out last night, you see teams this good sometimes, but you don't usually see them this good in January. Sometimes it takes a while for the parts to come. And again, this is a team that is still getting used to having Alan Flanagan back. To me, that is a lot of what makes this so impressive right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's I go back to the conversations, in June when I said that I thought there was a scenario, even though I ultimately went back to the Kentucky route because that's just what you do by nature. I think when you watch SEC basketball over the years, you just assume Kentucky's going to find their way to the top, and they still can. But I go back to thinking that I thought Alabama and Auburn could be the two best teams in the league, and Auburn has gotten there. Alabama hasn't gotten there yet. And, like I said, I think they can, but I hesitate when I say that now. I think that they can get there, but I can't tell you with confidence that they're going to. And I think that it goes back to those things we talked about a minute ago. There's no reason to sort of rehash it. Like those are the main things I think that are the issue right now for them. And maybe they will get there, but you talk about a schedule, right? We talked about Alabama playing the toughest non-conference schedule. They're going to have a stretch coming up here in 1 week from January 29th to February 5th where they're going to play Baylor, Auburn, and Kentucky. I
Ooh.
mean, it just, the schedule is relentless for Alabama, and it's not going to let up on Saturday. They hate playing at Starkville. Ask any Alabama fan, like, you hate playing that game at Starkville against Mississippi State. That's not going to be easy. And so, and then it's LSU right after that. And then you got to play Missouri again. The team's already beaten you. So there's just that, I think, is going to start to become the issue for Alabama, is they're going to have to find a way to they have to, I think, find ways to win the games like they're going to play against Mississippi State on Saturday. And I think they will eventually get some of these home games, whether it is LSU or, Kentucky, teams like that. I think they'll have an opportunity, but they've still got a ways to go. Whereas, like you mentioned, Auburn, I think, is already there. So
I thought the biggest positive, or one of the biggest positives for Alabama last night, was J.D. Davison, who's been bad at times for them. First of all, he threw down one of the best dunks you'll ever see over Walker Kessler. But I think more important for them going forward, 4 assists and 1 turnover. He had 9 points in 26 minutes. You don't need the 6 and 7 turnover games that he was giving them at times. You can't win that way in some of these games where you're playing top 15 teams. To me, if you're Alabama, that's one of the better takeaways.
yeah, I mean, it's something you can build off of, I think, with him. And I say it all the time. It's Jabari Smith's been different, right? But with freshmen, you're just going to have this sometimes. And I think that, again, I don't know that this is one where the potential is there with Davison, but I don't think we ever really looked at him as someone that was just going to, from day one, be putting up 20 a game and just be this unstoppable, player right into his college career. And I think that's always hard to predict, even with the best of guys, I think, that are freshmen. But I think for him, it was going to be sort of one of those scenarios where you're stepping into a group that's already very guard heavy with, Ellis and Shackelford and Quinterly and those guys. And so your role is going to be different. And so I think you certainly see the potential. And I talked about Alabama probably getting there eventually. I think he's going to get there, and we see what he can do. It is about limiting turnovers, and that comes, I think, with more experience and being in games like that, last night and those types of scenarios. So yeah, I mean, he's an excellent player with a lot of potential, and I think he'll be just fine. He'll have some rough games at times, but I think that he'll start to sort of grow into his role as the season continues. So
Let's talk Vandy, Kentucky. That really wasn't much of a game, which didn't surprise either of us. For Kentucky, Oscar Tshiebwe is just doing Oscar Tshiebwe things, except he bumped the scoring up to what he got, I think, 30 last night. Was plus 25. Missed, 5 shots from the field, 2 from the line, pulled 13 boards, which is almost low for him anymore in 35 minutes. Kellen Grady hit a couple of shots. Not a big night for him, but he's been big for them lately. Ty Washington is a guy that – I'm not going to say Kentucky's a better team without Xavier Wheeler, because I don't want to go there. We both think he's a good player, but Washington has now been the guy that has been thrust in the point guard role. And first night out against Georgia, he breaks, I think, a school record for assists. And then last night plays pretty well again. 15 points, 4 assists, plus 11. Kentucky won that one without ever really being challenged. If you look at the box and say it's a 12-point game, well, Vanderbilt scored the last 16 points of the game while Kentucky was disinterested. But I think if you're Kentucky, that's a team that took a step forward last night.
Yeah, on the Washington front, I think it's probably competition more than anything. Like you said, they're certainly, I think, better with Wheeler, but yeah, I played Georgia and Vanderbilt in those 2 games, and that probably allowed him to kind of feel a little bit better about where he's at in that role with Wheeler out. So that helped. But like you mentioned, this is if you didn't watch this game, you just look at the score. This was not a 12-point game. Like, it was not.
No.
That's a very misleading scoreline. Kentucky was up almost 30, I think, with 5 minutes to go, and yeah. So I mean, it's the same stuff for Vanderbilt. We said it, right? Like, it was a home game for Kentucky. Scottie Pippen had 32. Almost pretty much had half of Vanderbilt's points, and beyond that, what'd you get? You got Trey Thomas with 14 or 15, I think, and No one else really did anything. And I think that's kind of the issue where we've said is you feel like Vanderbilt, and I think they do overall. They have a better supporting cast than they've had, but you still don't have that consistency, I think, beyond the top player on the floor for them.
Yeah, I mean
Right?
they
I
don't
mean,
they don't have Liam Robbins. I don't know if they're going to get him. They don't have Rodney Chapman
yeah.
now, and now it's exposed the rest of the roster. They did not do a good job in recruiting. It is starting to show. Quentin Malora-Brown, who's been a decent post defender for them, it really drops off when he's out of the game, and Sheboy just killed him last night. And look, I think people know you and I live in the Nashville area. We've gone to I don't know how many hundreds of games in that gym between us. That gym used to be, and I've been front row and center for Metallica, right? And that gym's been louder than that concert. I'm not kidding you. It feels to me like we were watching that program die on the vine. I think that's the first time I ever remember Vanderbilt getting outnumbered by a fan base in its own gym. Now, Kentucky always brings a lot of people, and it especially brings them to Nashville. But you will see 4 or 5, maybe 6,000 Kentucky fans in that building, but it's always offset by a bigger number of Vanderbilt fans. You look at Vandy Twitter last night, people are hacked off, and they should be, because that program is it is a shell of what it's been, and that's what bad recruiting and bad decisions and bad leadership bring. And it's for a program that used to be one of the top 4 or 5 programs in the league. I think now year in and year out, they're the worst, and they've got to change a lot of stuff to get off that.
Yeah, it is interesting because we talk now. I mean, I've said it. I think very clearly. I think Auburn's the best home atmosphere in the SEC. But there was a point where it was Vanderbilt, and it is like you think about someone that just got into SEC basketball, maybe even I don't know what 5, 6, 7 years ago, and you're like, hold on a second, how was that ever the case,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, even the Stallings teams, like some of those games were just incredible. I mean, you think about the ones certainly against the Florida teams, the national championship teams, but even beyond that, the Shane Foster teams, and even going on to the Jeffrey Taylors and John Jenkins, like those were still, when Kentucky came into the gym, like those were, there's a lot of
Those
Vanderbilt
were
people in there.
special
Yeah,
nights.
yeah.
Special nights.
You marked it on your calendar, but this one,
Yeah.
it is like it's very simple. I think sometimes doing what we do, we obviously have to talk about a lot of different things, but things are very simple sometimes. If you just win games, like everything else will come. There's no, I mean, you just if you could just win, like everything usually takes care of itself for the most part. I think there are some other situations where, we talk about like a South Carolina. How much did South Carolina gain off of that Final Four run, right?
Nothing.
I don't know that I don't know that changed a whole lot in terms of just where maybe the program and the direction and everything. But like for a Vanderbilt, how much did things change when you don't win a game in the SEC, however long ago that was,
3
several years
seasons
ago?
ago. Yeah.
Yeah. And remember, that's not on Jerry Stackhouse. Like that's, and I say this too because I think, and this, like I'm telling you nothing you don't know, but and everyone for the most part I think knows this now. But the problems with Vanderbilt go beyond just the basketball team
Mm-hmm.
and beyond and I think there's something to that where I actually think Jerry Stackhouse is a pretty good coach, but I think that there are things that he's had to adjust to, and let's be honest too, remember what he took over, but I think it was one where I just think when you look at the whole scenario of the entire picture, not just from the standpoint of where things are with the basketball team when he walks in there, but where things are with the university
Mm-hmm.
and everything else going on, I think it was always going to be a scenario where you just didn't know how quickly things were going to kind of come together. And I think that's where, you make that hire of him, someone who has not been in that spot before, where he hasn't coached in college before, hasn't been around, the how things play out with college, whether it's recruiting, whether it's other things. And so you always knew it was going to be kind of an uphill battle, I think, from the start. And yes, I think they've gotten better, but it is, I think, part of the bigger picture of where this program has fall into. And I think they have done some things positive to try to push it in the right direction. And, certainly I think when you have a talent like Scottie Pippen and you're able to bring him and keep him there, it helps things. But overall, I mean, it's just still something to where, like you said, and we were talking about it, it's just Vanderbilt Vanderbilt basketball is not Vanderbilt basketball of what many people have known for many years. And I think that is where, when you look about, whatever, 15, 20, 100 yards away at the baseball stadium, and you see the things that can be accomplished in the right scenario, different sport. But Vanderbilt used to kind of be, known for basketball. And I think that's a hard thing for people to look at now and say, man, think about where we were. And now it is like, it's a program. We haven't seen a program bottom out the way that Vanderbilt bottomed out when they had that season a couple years ago. And still, I mean, I said it then, like this wasn't going to be a miraculous 2 to 3 year turnaround. Like this could be a 5-year plus where you've got to, have everything go right for you just to get back to that middle half of the SEC. And it just hasn't to this point. So,
well, there's a lot of layers to this, right? Because one layer is they can't catch a break. I mean, this is what, 6 years in a row they've lost one of their top 2 players for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never seen anything like what they go through with injuries. Yeah. And it's not losing your 8th guy in the rotation. It is losing your best. I mean, right now they're without maybe their 2nd and 3rd best players. Robbins for sure would be their 2nd best player. And Chapman, I think you can make an argument by his impact when he was in there that he was probably the 3rd. So there's that. And it's every year. It's with Stackhouse. It was with Drew. To some extent, it happened to Kevin Stallings at the end of his tenure. There's that. I agree with you. I think Jerry is a good coach. I don't know if he's a great coach, but I think that there was a lot of confidence, if not arrogance, coming into this job where he thought he would just show up and get kids and it would go his way, and it's not. When you were out, when everybody else is getting 4 and 5 stars and you're searching the bargain bin in April and May, and you're turning up kids who can't play at this level, which is what he did, this is where you get when you had a couple of bad breaks. Finally, the third thing, the leadership over there is awful, has been for years. At least when things go wrong, if you've got a backdrop with good and competent leadership, there's kind of hope. And I think that's where the fan base is right now, is they look to that and they don't see it, and I think they're right.
Well, and here's the thing, too, and we talked about this before, is this isn't the college basketball of even a decade ago where player development, and that's where I think Stallings, and we're not like, it's a different conversation, but he was one of those people during that era where I thought he got good players, but he also, that 2-3 year whatever, like he would develop them to the point to where you never really had the program sort of bottom out. It's right. Where you had
the floor with Kevin was really high, or not high. It was decent, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, once you fall to the point they fell to, it's hard to have that same strategy of maybe getting the guys who aren't as ready coming out of high school and needing 2 or 3 years to develop them to the point to where you're, back, I guess you could say, where you're quote unquote back to where you want it to be. And that's because the transfer situation has changed everything. It's just a different landscape. And that's where I think, like, the model that you use now is so much different, and that's where you have to hit on all these transfers, because otherwise every team can pretty much go into every offseason assuming that they're going to lose maybe 2 to 3 players off their roster. And that's where, like you mentioned, if you're replacing those guys with, 2 or 3 guys that maybe need a couple years or more to develop, we know, like, that's just much harder to do in this landscape. And like I said, I think the strategy itself is a fine strategy, and I think that's where I've always said I think Jerry Stackhouse actually probably doesn't get enough credit for being able to develop some of the players, but I think it's just the problem is it's like, because of where they were, it isn't coming along probably as quickly as you would expect, and knowing that, by the way, too, we can't forget this, the SEC is as good as it's ever been.
Yeah.
over the past 5 years. Just in terms of consistency, I think that you're between a rock and a hard place, and I think for Vanderbilt, it's just I don't really see a path that's as sustainable right now that as it would have been maybe before. Like you said, it's just there's so many combination of things that we could spend 2 hours just talking about it, and we probably spent 15 minutes talking about it now. And I don't think we even expected to do that, but
No.
that's just kind of that it is a program that has been so fascinating to see the ups and downs, and some I think are self-inflicted, some are not. So
Yeah, and good point about the development. Kevin was an underrated recruiter.
yeah.
A lot of times his issue was that when he had his best talent, he underachieved. But let's move on quickly to the last couple of games because I know we both have to do things here in a bit. A&M, undefeated, Blake. I thought Ole Miss, given the way Ole Miss had played, might make that interesting. That did not happen. You pointed to A&M's balance, which you're dead on about that. But Henry Coleman III, who was a Duke transfer and a four-star kid out of high school, has really come on for them, strung a couple of good games together. I think went 18-6 last night. And in the box score is just a bunch of other guys chipping in here and there. But that's a team that I'm really intrigued to see how it goes as it gets tougher. For Ole Miss, Jarkel Joyner didn't play again. Matt Morrell couldn't step up and be the elite scorer. He'd been a couple games in a row. And with that, that speaking of margin for error, Ole Miss is kind of fringy right now too. The Joyner absence probably showed up and hurt them last night. There were 9 assists to 13 turnovers, and with him in there, it's different. But I think the story out of this is A&M, Blake, and what is this team going to be when it gets tougher?
Yeah, on the Ole Miss side, I think they're probably about 8 deep anyways, and when you lose one of those guys, you're down to 7 deep, and you lose your best player maybe in that scenario. So I think it makes it tough in that setup. But I'm telling you, there's still room on the A&M bandwagon for anyone that wants to jump aboard. I think that, yes, I said, from the beginning when we talked about that Georgia game a week ago, I said, hey, if they win this game, road game, start SEC play, theoretically they could be 4-0 to start, SEC play, and here they are at 3-0, and now they go to Missouri on Saturday, which by no means is a gimme based on what we saw with Missouri and Alabama. But yeah, I think that there's a lot to take away from this in terms of I think A&M's pretty good. I think they're not a great team, but I think they're a Buzz Williams team, and more often than not, we've said that over the years. That's a good thing because they find a way. They'll do some of those little things, and they're always going to be pretty aggressive. And I've been very impressed with them thus far. But as we said, Georgia, Arkansas, Ole Miss, a little bit different than Kentucky, Arkansas, LSU that they're going to face here in about a week or so, with 2 of those 3 coming on the road. So big stretch coming up for them. 3 of their next 4 on the road. But for right now, hey, you're 3-0 and you're feeling pretty good about yourself, knowing you do have those road games coming up.
Tennessee, South Carolina was exactly as you called it, which you nailed everything last night. That was pretty remarkable. You take your victory laps. What's that?
You don't get many of those in the
No,
SEC,
you take your victory laps when you. I mean, we whiffed on a few certainly on Saturday, but I do feel like we're getting to know what these teams are a little bit more. I'm going to start with South Carolina here. From one night to another, I have no idea who's going to do what. Chico Carter had stepped up and become a player for them a little bit. Now he's a non-factor. James Reese, the fifth, has put together a couple of really good games in a row, led them with 15 last night. They got nothing from Cousinard last night. They're not getting anything from Keyshawn Bryant significant on a night-in and night-out basis. Willens Levex had a really underrated year for them, kind of under the radar, but that just right now looks like a team with a bunch of guys. And if there are worse Power 5 teams at holding onto the ball than Carolina right now, I don't know who they are. They turned it over 23 times last night. I think it was 22 in Nashville, and they won anyway. But I think our concern for Carolina was it just was a program going nowhere before the season. And that's kind of the team we saw last night in Knoxville.
Yeah, 8 players averaging between 5 and 11 points. That's just that's one of those
Which works for A&M, but it's not working for Carolina right now.
Well, and you need your top guy to be a little bit more than 11 in that scenario. So, yeah, they just don't have enough. They don't have that firepower I think you need to be able to be, a factor long term in the SEC. And like you said, if you're not getting enough from Cousinard, if you're not getting Keyshawn Bryant, it's just you're going to have issues. And this was a bad matchup. We talked about it. You're playing, an elite defensive team like Tennessee. This just was never going to be a good matchup for South Carolina. They turned it over 23 times, and they couldn't make shots. I mean, by the way, it doesn't help either when you're 6 of 17 from the free throw line.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much more to add than that. I mean, I just think this was a bad matchup for South Carolina for a team that's already kind of offensively not very good. When you're playing an elite defensive team, I don't think it's a shocker that you're only going to score 46 points the way they did on the road. So,
I don't know that we learned much about Tennessee. I mean, Jordan James had one of his better games of the season. But I mean, we kind of expected Tennessee to do this, and it did. Somebody mentioned last night on Twitter, Justin Powell's not getting a lot of shots for them right now, and I think that's kind of one of the missing pieces for Tennessee. That if they could get a guy to knock down 2 or 3 shots off the wing, that might really change that team's offense a good bit.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think that their rotation is pretty solid. And I think that's where, you have someone like him who is going to he's going to have one of those games. And I think he's probably had a couple this year where he's going to knock down shots. And I go back to that, which that was Presbyterian. I had to pull up his game log here, but it goes 5 of 5 from 3 in a game like that. But really beyond that, I mean, he's only hit, I think since then he's had 1 3 or that's it in each of these games. So he's had no more than 1 in the rest of the games to this point. I think because their rotation is pretty solid, he'll get his minutes, but will he get the shots each game? I'm not sure. Eventually, I think they'll probably need him, to make some of those shots in those kind of games. But I think it goes back to what we said, where if you have Jordan James, Vescovi stepping up and all these other guys, you can still get by and still be okay. But there probably will come a point where they need him to make some shots. But yeah, I didn't really take a whole lot away from Tennessee on this game. I just think they did exactly what you thought they'd do, and now they get ready for their biggest game of the season probably at this point. Well, not. I mean, they had some other big games, but talking about road games for sure. Talk about their road start SEC play with 3 straight road games. Your road games that you start with are going to be Alabama, LSU, and Kentucky.
Ooh.
That's not a fun slate for the road games to start, but that's we know how that's going to go on Saturday. That's going to be a fun one. So,
any parting thoughts?
Nope. Saturday's games, there's a lot of good ones. So, yeah, it should be fun to kind of look at those. I think maybe you kind of look at it on paper. There are some matchups that you think should be pretty, one-sided maybe, but I'm not so sure. Like we said, even games like Alabama, Mississippi State, ones like that, you just kind of never know. Even, I mean, A&M and Missouri has gotten more, intriguing just because of where A&M's at. So I think that it should be a fun slate. So.
Yeah, and for our listeners in Tennessee, we've got a nice partnership with Action 24/7. If they listened to you last night, they might have made a little bit off that. Tell folks a little bit about that.
Yep, we'll put the link in the description of the video. Action 24/7, first deposit, they'll match up to $800, I believe it is. And yeah, just use the code SOUTH14, and that is the numbers 14 SOUTH14. And yeah, you can do that, and a lot of games to come. So just click that link in the description and use that code, and they'll match your first deposit. So.
And if you're listening, please subscribe to our channel. That helps us out a lot. We've got videos previewing Wednesday night's action, which we put up yesterday. We'll be back on Thursday to recap Wednesday nights, and then we'll be back Friday to look ahead to the weekend. Also got some SEC football stuff. We're going to be talking about offensive and defensive player of the year races and how we rank those. I like to do that after bowl games and championship games, so those matter. So we'll have our final ratings coming up soon. Anyway, he's Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.